Hello, I'm Karen Tkaczyk from Vistatec Life Sciences, and I'll be today's moderator for our Life Sciences in Focus webinar on laboratory-developed tests. What now, where next? We have a terrific trio of guests who'll be introducing themselves in a moment. Let's start with a couple of housekeeping items so that everyone who is joining here today knows how to participate in the webinar. So there is a Q&A tab. Please use that to enter your questions for the panelists. We'll have ample time to address those in the last quarter of an hour. There's also a live chat panel. Feel free to connect to other attendees in there, and please do tell us where you're logging in from and help bring some energy to this online forum. For those of you with accessibility needs, you can turn on Zoom's automatic captions feature. And if you want to connect with any of the speakers today, please send me a message afterwards and I'll facilitate that. We are recording this session, so you'll receive a recording by email in next week sometime, probably, fairly soon. What we're going to do is start with a short presentation to frame the topic, because not everyone is quite sure what an LDT is. And then we'll move on to the discussion. So let's dive in first with introductions from our esteemed panelists. Cortez, would you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Okay, great. My name is Cortez McBerry. I am a former FDA reviewer in the Office of In Vitro Diagnostics. Following that experience, I moved on to the private sector where I worked for Becton Dickinson. They were a diagnostic company. And then for the last 5 years, actually, I've been a consultant at NDA Partners, primarily focusing on in vitro diagnostics and helping or assisting small and medium-sized companies to understand the regulatory field and how to get on the market.
Well, we're very glad to have you. Thank you very much for being here. Sean, would you tell us a little bit about your background and what you do at ECI?
Sure. Thanks, Karen. I initially had no intention of entering this industry. I was a lawyer in private practice, just doing fine. And then I ended up segueing into representing hospitals and healthcare institutions with their customer needs. So large capital medical device purchases such as MRI systems and breast imaging systems for center build-outs that translated to an opportunity. After doing that for about 20 years, it translated to an opportunity to move in-house with a medical device company, initially into the legal department, but then assisting with regulatory and quality and clinical needs, and then leading to opportunities to lead those functions at large and small companies. So concentrating in the regulatory and the quality and the clinical world. And then most recently, much like Cortez, entering in the consulting sphere, where we can assist both providing support externally or providing people power resources for essentially total product lifecycle management. So maybe beginning concept, design controls, all the way through to marketing pathways so that companies can get their products to market.
Thank you. And now, Tristin.
Yeah, hi, I'm Tristin Wolff Cope. I am the Regulatory Compliance Director at Biodesix, Inc. I have been in the quality regulatory space for about 5 or 6 years. I actually started in the lab. So running LDTs, looking at governing LDTs, and just kind of all the regulations around that. So.
Well, and obviously, our audience could also already tell we have a great trio with a perfect fit and an interesting spread of experience in the domain. So Tristin is going to frame the topic for us. So we're all eager to hear what you have to share. Go ahead, please.
Sure.
For the first few minutes.
All right. So starting off with laboratory developed tests, what now, where next? So I have to do a little plug. Biodesix, we are a leading diagnostic solutions company, providing advanced diagnostic tests and custom developed services, primarily focused in the lung disease space. So we have lots of LDT experience. We run 3 LDTs out of our laboratory based in Louisville, Colorado. And then we have an additional 2 that we run out of our laboratory in Kansas. So one of the biggest things is really how we're going to define this. So in vitro diagnostics versus laboratory developed tests. Laboratory developed tests are designed, manufactured, and used within a single laboratory. So that's really the key point here. They are not distributed or sold to any other lab or healthcare services. So looking at the difference between IVDs and LDTs, we're really looking at that interstate commerce part of IVDs, which LDTs do not fall under. They're also regulated by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, so CMS and CLIA, more in the laboratory space again, and they're different from IVDs because they can be developed, modified, and improved quicker than IVDs because the laboratory has full control over those design elements. On the other side, which more people I think are familiar with, are IVDs, which are in vitro diagnostic tests. Those are tests, diagnostic methods, tools that are intended to diagnose, treat, prevent, or monitor disease. Really, these are the interstate commerce side of those devices. So they can be distributed to other labs or facilities. They can be laboratory tests similar to LDTs. They can be products. They can be at-home tests. They've been regulated by FDA since 1976. That's why with the LDT ruling, which we'll get to, you see a lot of caveats and definitions of 1976-like devices, because that's kind of where that regulation really came into play. And with IVDs, there's really strict regulations around design controls, design lock, validation, all of that good stuff, which is a significant amount of time and resources to reach that marketing approval. I don't know if this group has seen the most recent PDUFA and MDUFA fees, but doing a PMA or a 510K is a pretty big lift. So this has been a conversation looking at the 1976 status here. This has been a conversation with the FDA for a long time. This is a very condensed, more recent timeline. I have it around the last 20 years. But if you search online for FDA LDT timeline, it is such a saga. It's gone back since 1938. So I wanted to focus on the more recent developments, specifically kind of within the last 4 or 5 years. So there's always been back and forth with FDA and how they want to regulate LDTs. So the FDA has stated that LDTs are a subset of IVDs, but because they are more regulated by CMS and CLIA, they kind of practice enforcement discretion. So LDTs are under the jurisdiction of CMS CLIA. They're still considered IVDs, but not regulated on the same level as IVDs per FDA. So it's always kind of gone back and forth every couple of years. We want to regulate, we want to practice enforcement discretion. We have some guidances, we take them down, they don't get finalized. And so really where I want to focus is in 2018, 2021. So the VALID Act, the Verifying Accurate Leading Edge IVCT Development Act, was first introduced into Congress. It didn't make it very far. And so it was reintroduced in 2021. This is as close as the VALID Act has actually gotten to passing. They set out a really collaborative arrangement with industry and what FDA wanted to see. So risk-based approaches, more of a structure for how LDTs are run versus physical IVD products, how to get them marketed, how to get them reviewed. So it was a very collaborative effort. Unfortunately, this was rolled into an omnibus that had to go through by the end of the year, so it didn't pass. After that didn't pass, in 2023, the FDA announced that they were going to propose a rule to regulate all IVDs and phase out their enforcement discretion approach. There was a lot of conversation around this draft rule. There were actually 6,500 comments that were made on this rule, which is insane for an FDA rule like this. There was a lot of conversation around academic hospitals and grandfathering clauses and risk. Again, very similar to the VALID Act, how LDTs would fit into this space. So there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of review, a lot of industry interaction. And in May of 2024, the FDA published this final rule, which we'll get into on the next slide. But what they decided was enforcement discretion was off the table. They were going to start phasing in LDTs to be regulated as IVDs fully, so bringing them up to that same level as IVDs. This caused quite a stir in industry. The American Clinical Laboratory Association, ACLA, and the Association for Molecular Pathology, AMP, both sued the FDA separately, stating that they were overreaching in their jurisdiction. As these lawsuits went through the process, they combined because they were basically stating the same thing. So that was kind of escalated in February of this year. There was an oral argument hearing that was held, and the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Texas vacated the final rule in its entirety. So the ACLA and AMP won their lawsuit, and that's kind of where we stand today. So with the LDT ruling, giving a little bit more information. So the LDT final rule was intended to amend the regulation to make it explicit that IVDs are devices under the FD&C Act, including if the manufacturer is a laboratory. So the way they were going to do this was in a phased approach, because a lot of the conversation that had gone on with the LDT ruling and the Valid Act is that that is a really big lift for a lot of laboratories. That's a lot of requirements and regulations and submissions and reviews and applications that have to get done, a lot of resources, a lot of time. So this was kind of how they phased it out. So by May 6th of 2025, which just recently passed, LDT laboratories would be required to comply with reporting for MDRs and corrections and removals. So this is 21 CFR parts 803 and 806. By May 2026, laboratories would have to register and list their sites, and as well as submit all of their labeling to the FDA for review. So this one hits 21 CFR part 801 and 21 CFR part 807 for that registration. And then the next three phases were kind of between 2027 and 2028. So quality system requirements, so design controls, purchase controls, acceptance activities, CAPAs, record retention, basically that whole 820 section would have to be, laboratories would have to be in compliance with that. November 2027 was where pre-market approval applications have to be submitted for high-risk LDTs. This is a key point because as LDTs stand and where they stood in this LDT final rule, everything was coming in as class 3. So everything that wanted to go to market would have to get a PMA in review, not necessarily accepted, but in review. And then to round out the phasing, May 2028, that is where the 510K de novo submissions for low to moderate risk LDTs would come into play. So thinking that PMAs would go in for high risk, those could potentially get approved. Maybe they would get deregulated. There was some conversation about de-risking certain devices as part of this conversation, but that never really went anywhere. So this was kind of the approach that FDA had stated. And what happened with this lawsuit? So the federal judge vacated and set aside in its entirety the final rule because of the lawsuit that was brought forward by industry. The court found that the FDA did exceed its statutory authority under the FDCA. And so the judge wanted to make sure that that ruling and that decision was in before that May 2025 deadline. So that was determined March 31st. So the decision effectively nullified the rule, maintaining the previous enforcement discretion for LDTs. So we got as close as we have to FDA regulation, but now we're back to enforcement discretion and we're moving forward as is. The FDA has until the 30th of this month to appeal the court's decision. And from what I've heard, I don't know what they're going to do. It's possible in this administration they will not appeal, but you never know. So that's why we're here to talk about LDTs, because we don't really know what's going to happen next, right?
That's exactly right. Thank you very much, Tristin. Great insights there, and a foundation for people who know less about it than you. So let's kick off the discussion with that by asking Sean and Cortez to respond. Sean, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Tristin, for that outline and that introduction. My sense is that there's a little bit of risk in this conversation on May 21st, with the understanding that it's possible that the government might appeal that decision in Texas. But my sense is generally that the decision that has been issued, and whether the government appeals it, neither of those avenues is going to be dispositive of the questions that are before us and the regulatory risk concepts that are before us for LDTs. My sense is that companies and manufacturers of products are still going to have to assess a pathway and determine whether their products meet the definition of an LDT or the definition of an in vitro diagnostic. Let's be mindful that the judge in Texas determined and reasoned that FDA's authority to regulate devices only extended to tangible physical products that are commercially distributed, and it didn't extend to professional services. I'm not sure whether the court had a true understanding of how the process works. And I say that because the decision was issued at a summary judgment stage, just on papers and pleadings. It wasn't issued after hearing any evidence. So I'm not sure there was a clear understanding on how laboratory developed tests actually function and how they are actually used in practice. So my sense is that FDA is still going to claim that it has authority to regulate LDTs, which include tangible physical products and rise to the level of an IVD. And they're going to claim that they're still engaging in enforcement discretion. And I think what manufacturers can expect is that there may be instances in which there's a dispute or discrepancy with their classification of their product. And you may think that you're an LDT, you're validated as an LDT, and that's your pathway, and you're fine. And then something will happen. There'll be a complaint, or there'll be a serious adverse incident. And my sense is that these will pop up on FDA's radar. There might be an inquiry, there might be a written communication. And as FDA digs deeper, they may make a determination that they feel that your product is an in vitro diagnostic, which might require some sort of FDA marketing authorization. So I think that's sort of where companies are going to find themselves. Are they prepared to defend that their products are true LDTs and meet that definition, and maybe are subject to clear requirements and are sort of self-validated, and maybe you have maybe you have a state approval with the New York State Department of Health? Or is your product actually an IVD, and you're going to have a discussion with FDA about whether you need to have something like a 510K validation pathway?
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight, Sean. I think for one, let me say, Tristin, you did an excellent job of providing a great background on LDTs in this very complicated history that the government has had in terms of trying to have enforcement discretion over these devices. I sense that as Sean kind of indicated, is that the judge may have not been very clear on what an LDT was, and actually introduced something very new in terms of a test kit service, is a kind of a new definition. And what we've been seeing from the market so far is that FDA is still going out and inspecting laboratories, right? Especially those that have single site PMAs, or they're a single site laboratory with a pre-market notification or a 510K approval. And I think it's making it very difficult for other manufacturers to kind of understand where they sit now. And I think FDA is themselves having a lot of conversations about how to move forward and regulate and have their regulatory authority. In terms of, I think that there's a lot of manufacturers who define themselves as LDTs, right? But there's a couple of things that FDA does have out there right now that it can immediately go after in terms of its enforcement. One being collection devices, the second being software, and so both of these are clear areas in which FDA does have oversight to regulate. And I think a lot of LDTs, or what they define as LDTs, send out collection devices that have not been approved or cleared for their intended use in terms of when they get back to the laboratory. But one area FDA is having a big question over, I think I should go back, is they can't, the judgment says that they can't regulate what happens in the laboratory, right? The services, the activities, how manufacturers or laboratories perform the test, right? But outside of the laboratory, FDA is having major questions about, well, how do we regulate these devices that are in a gray area in terms of being IVD versus a true historical, what they used to call a laboratory developed test, in which that test was run in one laboratory and was serviced that healthcare service or healthcare hospital in which they were based in.
Yeah, I mean, I think you both make great points. We've kind of seen that as well. There are different avenues for FDA, like you had mentioned, specimen collection kits, and software, because the kits that go with these LDTs are either, like you said, used outside of their intended use as they're approved or cleared by the FDA, or you have something like a convenience kit that has fully approved and cleared components, but that kit itself is still regulated by the FDA. And so that's one way that they can kind of reapproach this. We've also kind of, looked at clinical trials. FDA governs clinical trials. And if you're doing clinical trials with your LDT, that's another opportunity for them to kind of review and enforce the regulation. And there's been buzz around RUO equipment and reagents as well. Those are labeled as RUO, but need to be developed, validated in those laboratories. And so those are kind of going that same route of specimen collection kits of not necessarily what the intended use is approved for. So I think that's a great point. We've seen a lot of software too. I know, New York State CLEP has actually come out and said that they will not review LDTs that use AI machine learning software. So they kind of defer to the FDA on those too.
So that's interesting. I mean, so I think laboratory developed tests, I think, so I want to pose a bigger question is what do we tell laboratories now that are they're breathing a sigh of relief in terms of the LDT rule being vacated, but yet this fight is not over, right? It's been going on for 30 plus years, right? And I think there are some big some important things that came out of the LDT rule as proposed that could help laboratories and like quality systems, right? I think there's a lot of discussions about how laboratories ensure that they're manufacturing, for lack of a better word, I apologize, a test, right? And it's reliable, it's robust, and they can be done repeatably. And I think what we're telling laboratories right now, and what I'm seeing is that laboratories should move forward to doing the best they can in terms of having a quality system, right? It's not required, but there's some areas in which laboratories can learn and improve their case for being a robust and reliable manufacturing a robust and reliable test. And Tristin, you brought up an RUO thing. I think RUO is one of those gray areas in which FDA has opined, right? There's a guidance document out there, IUO guidance for laboratories and manufacturers and FDA. I think that's a very hard area, right? And I think FDA has opined and made it clear that there's certain approaches RUO devices should take and have labeling, and laboratories. I think laboratories have a good understanding of that, right? In which if they are using a RUO reagent, that reagent should be qualified and validated in a laboratory before it's imported into its test, right? And approach.
And I think, Cortez, there are those of us, and I'll fall into this category, and I think reasonable people may disagree, but the important question is how do the various regulatory bodies feel about this issue? But there are those of us who believe that RUO, or research use only labeled products, may not be used on humans, that they're only that can only be used really for bench testing or for non-human use, and then companies will then say, well, we will expand just a little bit, and we'll investigational use only or IUO label our products, and we'll obtain an investigational device exemption or some sort of an IRB approval for either sort of a non-significant risk product or something of that nature. And I think you do see manufacturers who play a little bit fast and loose with labeling that does not have a full marketing authorization. So RUO labeling and IUO labeling. But I do think that can be a bit of a red flag for regulators that maybe you don't have the full marketing authorization that's required for the risk level of your product. I think what we're going to continue to see for LDTs is that there's going to be a well-defined path. I think Cortez just alluded to this. There's going to be a well-defined path for a workflow for a customary test, and that's going to occur in let's say within a hospital setting. And then within a reasonable period of time for that specimen or sample, it's going to get into the lab. So maybe the workflow is sample taken, specimen taken, collected, gets to the lab within a couple of hours. Lab performs a relatively customary test at that site. And I don't think that is going to depart from commonly accepted recognition of an LDT. I think when those tests involve more complex software or more complex hardware, or what we see frequently is that those tests are not going to be offered in that hospital or clinical setting. They're going to be offered in an outside setting, such as a home use environment. And my sense is that although many of us bristle at regulation, oftentimes those regulators, and I know you, Cortez, were an IVD lead reviewer, often those regulators are not wrong, and their concerns regarding safety and effectiveness are quite legitimate. And I think what we've seen is that FDA loosened a little bit with emergency use authorizations during the pandemic and is now transitioning back toward more robust regulation, particularly when it comes to shipping and transportation of human specimens and samples. And so I think you'll see a lot of labs that sort of say, well, our control is to have the end user place the sample into a FedEx or a UPS sample bag and throw it into a box. And FDA would be concerned because that sample may then be exposed to conditions that are not ripe for good testing. You might have a blood sample or a urine sample that's now subjected to extremely high temperatures, or in Miami in the summertime, or extremely low temperatures in Alaska in the wintertime. And is hemolysis occurring? Is there damage occurring to the sample? Is the sample no good when it gets to the lab? Those are legitimate concerns that it can impact safety and effectiveness of testing. And I think companies should be prepared, manufacturers should be prepared to address those concerns.
I have a question for Tristin. So if you're not under the governance of the FDA, how do your LDTs get approved? Some in the audience aren't aware of how that works.
Yeah. So there's varying levels of regulatory governance for LDTs. So the very base level for LDTs is a CLIA certificate. So that's really you do have a quality system. I just want to clarify, LDTs have quality systems. But for CLIA, looking at kind of a validation perspective, you're doing analytical validation, and that's it. So you're looking at accuracy, precision, sensitivity, specificity, reference ranges, reference intervals. So you have to have that documented and on file. And then once you document it, you can run your test. A step up from that is an accreditation. So CAP, the College of American Pathologists, is really the most well-known, I think. And that is CLIA and then some. So having that analytical validation, you're also doing verification and validation for the test and the method that you're running it on. So not only analytical, but making sure that the method that you're using works. Audits come from CAP every other year. Your laboratory has to be audited. They come on site, you get your accreditation, and then you can continue providing your test. Where the gold standard is for LDTs is New York State Club. So New York State CLEP is actually CLIA exempt. So New York State is CLIA exempt. And what that means is the New York State CLEP approval and review and quality system process around LDTs is so robust that they said, CLIA is not good enough. We're going to go here. And CLIA agreed with them and said, you can be CLIA exempt. So what that means, if you have a New York State CLEP test, so if you're running testing on New York State residents, you have to have a New York State CLEP approved laboratory. So demonstrating that you have a strong quality management system, you're maintaining integrity of that patient sample, your quality controls are in check, your laboratory is running as expected and intended. And then you also have to have a laboratory director that has a certificate of qualification. So your laboratory and your lab director have to be approved by CLEP to be able to run a test. And then once you have those established, you have to get your test approved. So New York State CLEP requires a submission for any new assays or any assay modifications that you're running out of your CLEP approved laboratory. They look at analytical and clinical validation. So it's a pretty meaty submission. We did one for our NGS test and I had to send it in like multiple notebooks because there was so much documentation that I had to provide. But they're looking at, the method as a whole. So from start to finish, what is your specimen rejection criteria? How do you QC them? How do you run your assay? How do you review the results? How do you review the QCs? What do you do if something goes wrong in the laboratory? How do you notify, physicians if something went wrong? So there's a lot that goes into it. So the review packet is provided to Wadsworth. They have technical experts that review all of that information that you provide, all of your validation information, all of your literature that supports the validity and the clinical validity of your test. They'll go back and forth potentially if they have questions, if they need more information. They'll risk assess your test. So depending on how risky it is for patients and their diagnoses, you can get conditional approval where you can commercial sell it, run it while you're being reviewed, or it's a high risk assay where you can't do anything with it until it's fully approved. So once it's approved, you're free to run it. It's really the top tier of LDTs. And then anytime you modify your assay, you have to do a submission as well of here's what we're modifying, here's how we validated it, here's why it's important that we made this modification. Did that answer your question?
Well, it sounds pretty thorough. Yes, it certainly did.
Okay,
Guys,
great.
any thoughts?
I would want to say New York State does have a very robust review process for assays that are pretty mature, right? And I think as Tristin explained, right, that it's pretty thorough. I think that there's issues there in which not all laboratories or laboratory developed tests go to New York State, right? And there's gaps there, right? And I think the agency obviously saw that, right? I mean, there's a historical precedent. If you ever read the book Bad Blood, right? There are a lot of laboratories who don't go to New York State, who still operate and run tests, and CLIA is not really concerned with the validity of the test, right? They're really much more concerned about the running of the laboratory and ensuring that the laboratory has fail safes in place to ensure that their operations are above board, right? And so where the agency had felt that it should step in, and I think that this is where I kind of support the rule, is that the agency is really concerned about the validity of a test, right? Do the results, do the analytical and clinical validity, do the results equate to disease, right? So I think these are things that CLIA is unable to capture. New York State gets at this with a number of different devices, but New York State doesn't have that. It's not a nationwide program, right, to ensure that patients are being protected. But I think it's a good thing, and I think moving forward, I would pose this to Tristin, is that there are lessons that could be learned from the proposed rule that can be help out laboratories that are developing tests. That, like, what lessons can you learn from this, Tristin, in terms of your own laboratory?
Sure, that's a great question. So when we were kind of assessing where we stood with the LDT rule, we do have New York State CLEP approval. So we are kind of in that top tier of quality management. But, you know, really looking at it, it was the resource concern. So we had started to develop corrections removals, MDRs, having processes in place. That's fine. Registration and listing, labeling, also fine. Where it was kind of starting to get a little spotty, and I think for a lot of people, is those phase 3 actual pre-market reviews. We were kind of in a good spot because the LDT final rule did have a carve out for New York State CLEP approved laboratories and tests. They were going to continue enforcement discretion for that particular component. But that was, I think, for laboratories that are working at a high quality standard and want to maintain the safety and the efficacy of that device for patients, that was kind of really where that was going to be a struggle. It's a lot of work, and it's really expensive to submit. And so I think that was kind of really just the point that we saw where it's like, ooh, like this is going to get kind of testy for other laboratories.
I think one thing that you referenced a little quietly, Tristin, was an experience submitting an NGS LDT to New York. And for those not familiar with that concept, NGS is next generation sequencing. And I think most of us in sort of lay speak would think of it as DNA testing would be the most common concept there. And so let's say there's a carve out under the currently not under repeal and vacated LDT final rule for New York State approval for a laboratory developed test. At the same time, curiously enough, FDA has issued very specific guidance on NGS, or next generation sequencing, with the understanding that FDA has authority to regulate, particularly where there's more than a mere service. And I would put forth that it's difficult to execute a DNA test or an NGS test as a service solely without the benefit of hardware and software. And I think FDA's position is going to be that when there's not merely a service, a testing service, but also significant hardware and significant software interacting, I think FDA's position is probably going to be that we think that might fall into the purview of an in vitro diagnostic that requires a 510K. But let's have a discussion and let's find out whether your pathway that you've carved out is sufficient, whether it's valid, whether it's robust, whether we can ensure the safety and effectiveness of the test for the population against whom it's being used. But I don't think that it's again, I don't think that there is a dispositive determination yet of whether something such as a next generation sequencing test can be merely an LDT with the New York State approval, or whether it requires a 510K. I just don't think that there's clarity yet.
Well, the interesting thing, though, Sean, is that actually New York State is actually approved as a third-party reviewer for NGS tests, right?
Right.
So I think there were safeguards there in which the FDA does trust New York State CLEP for these type of devices. But I think your second point is, well, how about all the software and hardware interacting? And as Tristin said, the New York State CLEP doesn't want to, at this point, they're not going to touch software. And so I think moving towards the future, I think these are really important questions that we should ask, especially as now we're moving towards AI and its influence on medical devices, and you also had some issues with interoperability. So I think there's a lot of LDTs out there that pull information from a number of different sources, and say in vitro diagnostics, heart rate monitors, right, pulse oximeters, right, to bring together, make a decision, and provide an output. And I think those devices clearly fall within the purview of FDA as they involve software and software. Software as a medical device, right? That definition. So I think these are next steps in which laboratories should be thinking about in terms of how they set up these devices, how they govern or manage a quality system, right? And when they need to come into the agency. I think those are really important questions that LDTs in the future, these more modern LDTs, will need to go through a series of questions in determining when and if they need to go into the agency to be reviewed.
And I know that we have a limited amount of time today, and I know, Karen, that at some point we probably wanted to discuss not only U.S. FDA
Let's
and
go right there.
CMS
How
positions on
do other
LDTs.
jurisdictions handle LDTs? That's
Yeah, how do
yeah.
other jurisdictions handle LDTs? And I think following up upon a little bit of what Cortez was getting toward next is there in his mentioning of interoperability as an example. I think other jurisdictions might focus a little bit more on other aspects of these tests. They may focus on the degree to which a product that's used in the test might be sterilized, and what is the sterilization method, and how do you validate that sterilization. They may focus, regulators in other jurisdictions may focus on biocompatibility of the products that are used in the test. How do they interact with the person from whom the sample is being taken? So I think that manufacturers of products, we haven't talked about, but we could just touch briefly on the U.S. is going to be harmonizing ISO 1345 formally by final rule this coming year in 2026, and I think companies are preparing for that. But I think globally, I think you're probably talking about, for the most part, we're probably beginning with the concept of whether CE marking is required, whether European market entry is desirable, whether Asian market entry is desirable. And I think what's going to happen there is we will not depart from traditional norms and traditional themes and concepts of product classification and product risk. So you might have a system in the US in which we have something like 3 levels of classification, and you might have something in Europe, or you might have something in let's say Japan, for example, where there might be a different number of classifications. So there might be 4 classifications if you're regulated as an in vitro diagnostic in Europe. And I think classifying your product is going to be key. So where do you fall on the classification scheme, and then once you've determined accurately where you fall on the classification scheme, what do you need to demonstrate in terms of product safety and effectiveness? What standards apply, and what testing is required?
Yeah, any thoughts on the rest of the world, Cortez, Tristin? You want to opine?
No, I'm not.
You're a US expert.
I really focus on the U.S. And I think there's in Europe there's issues going on right now, right? So I think in companies making that judgment, they really have to assess a number of different business objectives. I don't think it's any faster to get through to the EU. So that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I think what in terms of, we all have war stories, and I think some of the experiences that I've had, particularly with blood collection devices that might be used in clinical trials globally, or that might be used in what are perceived as laboratory developed tests or in vitro diagnostics globally. I think from war stories, we have interesting times, right? We have, if your product is a medical device and requires a license in Canada, you're going to have an MDSAP certified quality management system. I've had an unusual experience, which is I've had the same exact product, literally, we're going to take the same exact hardware product and label it, and US FDA classifies it as an in vitro diagnostic, and a notified body in Europe classifies it as a non-in vitro diagnostic medical device only. And so I think that's an interesting conundrum. What is it? So is it fish or fowl? And you have a product, and you have to be prepared to defend it in US and to support your marketing authorization pathway as an IVD, and your regulators in another jurisdiction are saying, we don't believe that it's an IVD, your reference authorization for an IVD is going to have to be conducted with additional testing to support its market entry as a medical device in Europe, for example. And then you might have a situation where your clinical data was robust and it was reviewed, and even the metadata was reviewed by US authorities, but due to circumstances. So, for example, we know there have been some issues in Japan with large companies fudging their clinical data. And we know that let's say PMDA has to review your product in Japan. They're going to definitely ask for your clinical trial metadata. They're going to ask for all supporting data. And then you're going to go off on a tangent as to, your Excel spreadsheets are merely a tool and not your control and so forth. So these can go down divergent pathways. But basically, on the global scale, you're going to be looking for the traditional concepts of what is the product risk, what is the product classification, is it a medical device or an in vitro diagnostic. There are some minor carve-outs for LDTs, and you might have a situation where if you go to Canada, there might be provincial requirements rather than Health Canada requirements. But for the most part, these traditional concepts of what is the product, how is it defined, what is the risk class, and then what is the testing that's required to demonstrate safety and effectiveness.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have some questions in from the audience. They look pretty intelligent, pretty smart people watching here today. So here's the first one. Here's a follow-up for you, I think, Tristin, this one. It's also key to note the various pathways from CLEP in addition to full LDT package review. Not all CLEP approval is equal. Would you speak to that as well?
Yeah, sure. So like I had mentioned, there are different risk levels for assays that go through that review. They can be low risk, no review, moderate risk, conditional approval, and high risk, full review. There's also some lifestyle submissions that you can do that go through a different path, clinical trial assays. So assays that are used solely in a clinical trial on New York State patients, those do not get a CLRS review. But you still have to submit it, but it goes right through. They just have it on file. And then there's also options for like exemption submissions. So if you have an LDT that's been approved by CLEP and you make modifications to it, you can demonstrate based on how you validate internally, demonstrating to CLEP, this is how we do sensitivity specificity. This is our population that we run generally. This is the number of samples that we validate against. You can get your method approved, which will give you an exemption for those modification submissions. I think you just have to give them an example one like once every 5 years. So there's a lot of options through New York.
Very good. If any of you would like to comment on there's a comment in the chat from Heather about RUO. If any of you have any additional thoughts on that, feel free. And if not,
well, I think we just touched on it, and this question may have been triggered by a comment I made that reasonable people may disagree as to whether RUO labeled products may be lawfully used on humans. I tend to think that RUO only, I tend to read the guidance in a relatively conservative manner in that regard. I don't promote RUO use on humans. I feel more comfortable with investigational use only labeled products to be used on humans. I support bench testing of RUO labeled products. I think when it comes to investigational use, if you're obtaining some sort, you don't need a full marketing authorization, but you should be considering obtaining some sort of an institutional review board or IRB approval to use on humans, or some sort of an investigational device exemption directly from FDA for use of those products which don't have full marketing authorization yet.
So RUO, IUO has always been a gray area and a loophole used by some manufacturers to avoid having to, as Tristin said, go through a pre-market review and pay the fees, but also to perform the clinical validation studies that are needed for some of these reagents. The FDA has published both an RUO guidance, and then also they have an analyte-specific reagent guidance document that they've published. I think that most people should sit down, have a look at that, and understand how the agency defines both of those issues, and what they're thinking. Although these are old, what their current thinking may be on the use of those. Um, I do understand, and I'm realistic. I understand that laboratory developed tests, especially being a scientist myself, right? In the lab, in my past, that labs will use RUO reagents or RUO labeled reagents and test on human specimens, right? And I think Tristin will probably attest to this: is that most laboratories, those good ones, the top tier ones, should have procedures in terms of qualifying those reagents, and having IQ, PQ, and other quality procedures to ensure that they're robust, they're repeatable. The results that you get are robust, repeatable, and that the laboratory has procedures to ensure that anytime they get a new batch, or if there's a new reagent that they need to replace, they go through a whole qualification procedures in terms of validating the performance of those reagents. I think it's really difficult for manufacturers to, like, I did a lot of flow cytometry, right, in my past, and it's really difficult for those manufacturers to have any to take on any more liability than what they've already taken on in terms of manufacturing and distributing those things, right? And to ask them to do more, it's very difficult. So I think laboratories, and I think again, Tristin could understand this, is that laboratories are hopefully taking procedures and safeguards to ensure that those reagents work, they're valid, and they can be robustly used and repeatably to help ensure the robustness of their assays.
And I think there are some additional considerations for manufacturers in terms of risk and regulatory risk. And that is, we often focus on the primary regulatory bodies and agencies, but I think oftentimes we lose sight that in a total product lifecycle development world, there are other bodies that regulate. The Federal Trade Commission also regulates labeling, but I think an occurrence or a past experience that I've had is having oversight of a blood lab where perhaps the blood lab in which employees are working, perhaps those employees were not offered a hepatitis vaccine as required by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So you feel that you're complying with marketing authorization requirements and regulatory oversight for your products, but you also have to comply with regulatory oversight for your people. So there's a multifaceted compliance requirement to manufacturing a product that doesn't only involve marketing pathways. It involves managing people and their safety as well.
Sean, I have a question for you, and getting us back to LDTs and the rule, and what's next is, what are some best practices that you can give companies to stay agile and quick to adapt to the changes in compliance in this kind of environment? The LDT rule is out, but that doesn't mean it's over, right? ISO 1345 is being recognized, right? So what would you tell a company coming to you to kind of get an idea of what they should be doing to prepare for next steps, which may be unknown?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that one avenue that is available to companies is to consider erring on the side of caution. And one thing that a MDUFA user fee is not required for a pre-submission communication with FDA. So I think if companies want to consider, we think we have a marketing authorization plan, or we think we have a pathway to market, can we have a pre-submission meeting? Can we obtain feedback? And although, Cortez, FDA isn't technically in the business of consulting, they will offer some guidance, and occasionally they'll offer quite a bit of insight as to a marketing pathway. I've had literally FDA saying, well, would you consider, a co-submission with a reagent manufacturer or something of that nature. So there are innovative pathways that oftentimes companies don't internally come upon. But if you want to have something like a pre-submission discussion with FDA, there might be a pathway where both the manufacturer and the agency can put their heads together and come up with what might be a least burdensome pathway that those entities individually had not thought of.
We have a great question here from Ingrid. If the FDA's proposed final rule had gone into effect, what do you think the effect on industry would have been? Is FDA approval or clearance commercially feasible for most of these products? So it's a broad question, but how many do you think would give up? What do you think? Anyone willing to?
Could you repeat the end of that question? I think it was.
Is FDA approval or clearance commercially feasible for most of these products?
Well, the great thing is that so some of these products were going to be grandfathered in, right? And what that means is that if you were on the market prior to the initiation of the final rule, you were brought in under some certain circumstances in which you couldn't make significant changes to the device. And those significant changes are like a change in intended use, a change in the operational principle, things of that nature. So what you would have seen is that a lot of these LDTs that were already on the market would have been grandfathered in and would have been devices. That comes with a catch, though, is that now you're under the purview of FDA, and now they're going to go out and inspect you, and that's where the problems come in. Now, not the problems, the threshold, I think, in which Tristin probably understands this comes in, is that FDA investigators will go out there and look at your device. They will look at your design controls. They will look at whether or not you are reporting issues, right? You're reporting and MDRs, things of that nature. And that's where I think that the threshold in terms of resources and people would have became really difficult, and a lot of laboratories would have faded off into the abyss. And is it a good thing? Not, yeah, it could limit the tests that are out there. Is it a bad thing? Yeah, I mean, again, it could limit tests that were available to people to individuals. But I'll let Tristin talk about that. I think that's a major issue she's dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ingrid poses a really strong question. Like, from a commercial standpoint, what does that mean? And there's a lot of labs. I mean, I feel like I pull this number all the time. There's, I think most recently about 330,000 CLIA certified laboratories, and that's kind of like the base. And that's a lot of labs that have to submit all of that data and do all of the work for pre-market submission. So I would expect to see a lot of those laboratories kind of fall off and, risk assess, is this worth the resources? Is this worth the bandwidth? And to do a submission that's not even guaranteed it's going to get approved. We did see, after the final rule came out and they stated that New York State CLEP laboratories would be exempt, we did see some rumblings around New York State CLEP stating that they would not approve laboratories without a test. So I think there was a strategy there to get a New York State CLEP approval just to kind of maintain for a little bit. But yeah, I think that was one of the biggest concerns from industry, was that it was going to be such a resource impact to these 300,000 laboratories. And while there are some that can hang and can, really work at that FDA level, I think there were a lot that kind of ignored FDA readiness for a while. I mean, this has been a conversation for so long, and I think that the companies that paid attention were really the ones that were kind of more set up for success had it gone through.
Yeah, I think the larger companies might be set up also to handle the requirements that FDA would impose. So it's the larger pivotal type clinical trials might be able to be absorbed by larger LDT manufacturers. I think that might be problematic for small startups and smaller manufacturers.
Thank you all very much. I think we could talk about this for hours, but we do need to wrap up. Any final thoughts and farewell? Sean, you're unmuted. You go first.
Yeah, I think that it's going back to don't abandon the traditional concepts. So traditional concepts of assessing your product, assessing product safety and risk classification, and then I think there's this concept of attempting to work collaboratively with the regulators to see if you can come upon an agreed marketing authorization pathway that's least burdensome and that works for you, for your company, and the regulators.
Thank you. Cortez, Tristin?
I would second Sean's advice, and I think if you're a company or a laboratory, get good regulatory help, right, to help you identify or understand whether you're a medical device and how you should move forward and being compliant with either CLIA, CMS, New York State CLEP, or the FDA. And I think that's a very conservative but good approach in the future.
Thank you. All right, last word to you, Tristin.
Sure. Yeah, I think that even though the LDT final rule got vacated, I think that this discussion just alone is a really good example of we're having the conversations about LDTs, we're getting more exposure. And I think that there's an opportunity to really recognize that laboratory developed tests still need some sort of regulatory structure. It just might not fit in IVDs, but we're at least starting the conversation back up again, and it's getting more attention and it's getting more eyes on it. So hopefully it goes in the right direction in a more collaborative way.
Thank you all so much. Big thank you to all three of you for joining us today and sharing these insights. And a big thank you to our audience for great questions and for joining us today. We appreciate your input in the survey afterwards, especially on suggestions for future topics for these such webinars. And thank you all very much, and bye-bye.